Hi everyone, welcome back. It's time for week 5, lecture 2. Today, just a mini lecture, a short lecture covering material culture as a topic, and just giving you kind of a theoretical background on how to work with objects as historical sources. So this is building on last week's second lecture about how to find objects and find resources. So this will also help you with your object study paper. We're going to start out by talking about what material culture is and what I mean when I say material culture. We're going to look at Leora Oslander's article to do that. That's an article that's now available to you online in our folder. And we're going to talk about why study objects instead of, just text or something else. And I want to start out with this mystery object and what this thing is. So to begin with, what is material culture? I'm going to get started with that first. Material culture is a relatively recent movement across history and the other humanities disciplines towards studying things that are not simply written down. Studying objects as historians, for example. Objects have traditionally been the kind of a part of the domain of archaeologists, and so studying objects for historians has not always been kind of a natural thing. But over the last 50 or 60 years, you could say, and especially in the last 20 or 30, there has been a drive by some historians, and we're going to look at one of them now, Leora Oslander, to treat objects as more important sources in studying history. And I'm going to read to you the first couple of paragraphs of her article just to give you her argument, and I'll reinforce that maybe a little bit. So let me close the webcam here, and I'll open up her article. And you can look at this yourself. It's in our Google Drive folder. It's called Beyond Words by Leora Oslander. And the introduction here is very good. It kind of gives you a clear sense of why we should study objects instead of just words. All right, so historians are, by profession, suspicious of things. Words are our stock in trade. This is not to say, of course, that historians have never had recourse to non-linguistic sources, from the use of archaeological evidence in the 19th century to Marc Bloch's brilliant notion that the intricacies of medieval landholding patterns could be deciphered by observing the interwar French countryside from a small plain. Historians have looked beyond the holdings of archives and libraries. Scholars of the ancient, medieval, and early modern worlds, and of science and technology, those whose written sources are limited or whose very object is material, have pushed the evidentiary boundaries the furthest, although some modernists and social and cultural historians have also used visual, material, and musical sources. Despite these initiatives, however, most historians view words as the most trustworthy as well as the most informative sources. Everything else is merely illustrative or supplementary. I will argue here, by contrast, that expanding the range of our canonical sources will provide better answers to familiar historical questions, as well as change the very nature of the questions we are able to pose and the kind of knowledge we are able to acquire about the past. Each form of human expression has its unique attributes and capacities. Limiting our evidentiary base to one of them, the linguistic, renders us unable to grasp important dimensions of human experience, and our explanations of major historical problems are thereby impoverished. Within the general category of the extralinguistic, I will make an argument for the utility and importance of material culture in particular. Okay, and I will stop reading there. But this article is very good if you want some theoretical background to underpin your object essay. I encourage you to look at it in more detail. It is a lengthy article. You don't have to read the whole thing to use it. And she does get into the study of some very specific objects. But I really do encourage you to look at it, and it would be a good one to look at if you want something to cite in terms of sources to back up your arguments. So what is material culture? As Leora Auslander has told us, it's the study of things. It's the study of what they're made up of, how they were made, their impact on human life or non-human life, and their significance to the history of a people or place. Um, Material culture doesn't necessarily always have to do with finished objects. It could have to do with the production of goods in a society, the acquisition of something like wood or metal or oil, for example, in our society. And it is a way to access materials from history that don't have to do with writing things down. And this gets to why study objects, my third point here. Um, for the bulk of human history, and especially in this course, almost all of this course, most people on Earth could not read or write, right? This is a time in history, the pre-modern world, when reading and writing are privileged, elite activities. They're something that is limited to a very small segment of society. And so to make big arguments about the world around this small group of people based strictly on their writing is to really take their point of view as kind of gospel, as the truth, the objective truth from their perspective. Um, and by studying objects, you can start to look at members of society who were not reading and writing, or not reading and writing very much. And I want to start by looking at this mystery object, because that's one very compelling argument, I think, for studying objects, is you get a bigger, broader view of history and the people in it. And this object will do some things to demonstrate that. So I want you to stop the video here after I finish talking in a second and think for a few seconds or a minute and come up with a guess. What do you think this object on the screen is? Looking at it, what do you think this thing might be? Take a close look at it, zoom in if you can, and think about it for a minute. And this is an activity we would have done in class, but I want you to pause the video now, and I'll sit here quietly for a second, and you think about it. What is this thing? Okay, so we're unpausing the video now, and I'm going to tell you about it. Here's an early modern version, the one we were just looking at, likely from the 17 or 1800s, perhaps a little bit earlier, a little bit too late for this course, but this is just for a demonstration. And here's a modern day object on the right from the 1900s to maybe the 1960s or so, not that old. And what this is called a sumitsubo. It's a Japanese carpenter's measuring tool. If you've ever done any construction, you may be familiar, or any carpentry or anything like that, you may be familiar with the idea of a chalk line. And what this is an inkwell here in the center, which would hold a wadded piece of cloth or cotton or hemp, and that would be soaked with ink. And then you would run a small line across it that is spooled here, and use that to snap a straight line onto a board, like you see in this diagram. So you'd pull it over the board, and then, like snapping a bowstring, you'd snap it down, and it would slap the board with the ink and make a perfectly straight line for you. This is something carpenters still do today. We generally do it with chalk these days, and a modern day version of this object would be here on the right. Looking briefly at the object I showed you, the specific object I showed you, there are some interesting indicators about Japanese carpenters that you can get from this thing. First, it's very intricate, right? It's very highly decorative. We have maybe a flower here, a wheel that is quite decorated, the ink pot itself is decorative, and then right in the middle, we have, very interestingly, a carpenter using a sumitsubo, using a snap line on a board. So this is kind of a meta object. It describes itself right in the middle there with this imagery. And this carpenter is using the tool itself for its intended purpose. And something you wouldn't know about these without studying them, or maybe you've heard about them before, is that the carpenter himself would make this object. So he would carve this himself out of one or several pieces of wood, and it would be kind of the signature piece of the carpenter's toolkit. It would hang on the waist or be carried in the hand, and the rest of the materials might be in a box. Other measuring devices, saws, hammers, etc., might go in a toolbox. But this would be the signature piece. And it does several things by being the signature piece. One, it distinguishes you from all the other carpenters, right? This is the Sumitsubo of Kevin, the great carpenter Kevin, and that would be clear. And it also demonstrates the skill of this individual carpenter. So if you hire me to build your temple, to build your castle, to build your house, or whatever else you're having built, you know that I am quite capable, especially as a detailed carpenter, of doing highly intricate, highly detailed work. And you see that in both of these objects here. We see a crane nestled around the ink pot in the second one. And you might have a name engraved in the spindle or the handle for this crank here. And some of them are quite simple. They could be very basic and very utilitarian, or they might become so elaborate that they're essentially useless as an actual tool, this one on the left. And these ones that were, and sometimes they still produce them, highly elaborate and decorative like this, might not ever actually be used for their intended purpose. Someone might not ever actually build anything with this object. It might be stored in a temple relic hall or museum as a part of the material that is displayed by that temple to signify its significance and importance. You also get from this kind of object a sense of the significance of carpentry to Japanese history more broadly. So I could make an argument about how important carpentry was because most things for the bulk of Japanese history and even today were often made of wood in terms of smaller structures. Of course, we have skyscrapers today. That's very recent in terms of historic developments. But for the bulk of Japanese history, almost everything was made of wood. There are multiple reasons for this. It's the most abundant and easily worked material in pre-modern Japan. Wood structures are actually quite resilient to earthquakes, against earthquakes, which has always been a consideration in Japan. And so making things out of wood has long been a significant part of the Japanese material culture and material history. So this object lets you tap into multiple elements of Japanese history that you might not get from text. These carpenters, most of them were probably not writing much down, probably not keeping diaries or writing a lot of letters. Some of them may not have been able to read or write at all. After all, this is technically a laborer's job or the job of someone who works with their hands and is outdoors a lot, not inside, not working with paper and brush in this case. So this lets you look into a world that would otherwise be quite inaccessible or which might be written about by elites without a real connection to the work itself. So there are some interesting reasons for writing about an object like this. And I wrote a paper about this object in grad school. And so this is one of my inspirations for having you write a paper like this, because it was actually quite a fun paper for me to write. And hopefully you're starting to think about how we make history and how we study culture in looking at objects instead of words. That's part of what I want you to get out of this assignment. I want you to think about what sorts of things we can use as sources to study the past. And I mean things, not in the vague sense, but actual physical objects rather than written sources. We've already talked a little bit about material culture and what it can tell us about the past. And I will refer you to that article, Leora Oslander's Beyond Words, if you want to learn more about that. And in terms of what material culture lets us learn that text might not, I've already touched on that. You also get a sense of things like consumption and use of resources. The use of the environment around you is more apparent when you're looking at objects and landscapes as opposed to just written words. Another thing to be said is that people can lie pretty regularly in their written sources. When you're reading a written source, you have to look out for lies or embellishments or perhaps complete fabrications made by the authors. And sometimes material culture can help you get around these things. If one of the emperors in China is telling you something very specific about production and consumption in their realm, but you can look at the material record and see that in fact this was not true, that they didn't have this abundance of, let's say, a precious metal or something, because there's no evidence that it existed in the material record, it's not there in the ground. That might lead you to wonder, was this person lying outright? Did that material go somewhere else? Is there something not being written about here? And it just gives you that extra angle of kind of inquiry into what you're looking at throughout human history. I've already talked to you about what Sumitsumo tell you about Japan, but why choose this kind of object to study? Sometimes it can be quite personal. So for me, my father is a carpenter. It's what he's done his whole life. And I, in my summers since middle school, have also been a carpenter. I've helped with him, work on building houses and things like that. So the object you select can have a very personal element to it. I was curious about carpentry and learning about carpenters. So I chose this object out of that specific selfish interest. And that is perfectly fine. If you have a hobby or one of your parents' careers or your potential career path that you think is interesting and you want to study it, there's probably some kind of object you could use to study that thing in detail for this course, especially in how it existed in the pre-modern world. And once again, I want to reinforce that our goal for this unit is a virtual museum exhibit built by you. So I encourage you to find things that have significance to you individually, to you personally, some relevance. Your paper probably won't depend specifically on that, but you're free to talk a little bit about that in your museum label. You could say that. You could mention it in your paper. I welcome that kind of personal touch in your works. That's up to you, but it's a great way to find something that might interest you. Is to think of something you're interested in now, and then you can probably find an object from a long time ago that relates to it. Here are some more examples. I just thought I'd throw in a few more examples from another class I taught. I already gave you some images from, that was from last term, and this one's from a couple of years ago. These are all Japanese objects. You can see coins here. These are sword guards. I gave you the paper for these sword guards. That's our sample paper. We have a castle, a temple, one of the world's oldest wooden structures, a tea caddy, an empress's or lady of the court's undergown. This is like the underwear of an empress, essentially. And a guessing game on seashells that would be involved with a lot of drinking. So this is, if you're interested in games, this would be the kind of thing you could look at, old pre-modern games. So just to remind you just a little bit about the criteria for the things you can study. Once again, you have to have reliable information on it. You must be able to demonstrate the significance of this, and this is what you prove in your paper. And you have to have high quality images for this thing. And so what would be in your museum? Can you think of an object that you'd want now? Are you able to think of one? Have you thought of one yet? If not, it's probably time for you now to pretty much buckle down and think of one in the next few days so that you're ready to go to get going on your paper. And it's a really good idea to have your object figured out here before the break, before our spring break, so that you're already good to go for learning more about your topic. You want to know where you're going to find it, why it's historically relevant, and why it matters. And here's one more example. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I wanted to put this in the slides. Here's another example from a student with a lengthy museum label. So this is a really excellent museum label. Yours doesn't have to be this long, but this object is kind of 3 objects in one, so the student decided to label each of them. But this is another object you could gain some inspiration from, maybe, if you want to go ahead and read about this yourself. In the interest of keeping this lecture short, and I really do want to keep it short, I'm going to keep moving. I just have one more significant slide here, which is recapping from last time on the Silk Road and Buddhism. If you're interested in objects from the Silk Road, this is really a huge chunk of the world, right? The Silk Road is basically all of Eurasia is included, part of the Middle East, part of Africa is included, and there are some good online museums for this. The Penn Museum's Secrets of the Silk Road site is great, and then I'm going to close this for a second so that I can get to this link. The Met's Silk Road site is also quite good. So this image is actually from the Met. Sorry, and this image is from the Met, and it gives you a sense of some of the objects that are found along the, or not from the Met, from the Penn Museum. It gives you some objects that are on the Silk Road, and this website is actually quite good at telling you about the Silk Road. And then to look for objects, you might be able to find some here. Especially, you'll find some good keywords and some objects themselves here. But Buddhism Along the Silk Road on the Met Museum website has both a nice little essay here, a video you can watch, and then quite a few objects to look at in case you're interested in finding something from the Buddhist world for your objects. And there are multiple pages of these, and they just keep going. So quite a few things here that you could study. Of course, you do not have to study specifically Asia or the Silk Road. Last time I gave you, or last time I was talking about this, I gave you some examples from Greece and Rome. You don't have to study those either. You could study the New World. You could look at the Mayan side of the world. Mayan ruins could be, those can fit into our virtual museum, or artifacts from Mayan culture or civilization. Other objects from native North America would be great. I know I haven't talked about that much yet, but it's, the lack of sources is the reason. But I wanted to give you a couple more museum pieces here from the Penn Museum and the Met, and this time on Asia. And I'm going to wrap this up as quickly as I can to try not to spend too long today, because the lectures have been a bit long the last few times. But next time, we have one more lecture before the recess, before the break, and that'll be on classical Chinese philosophy in the Warring States. You should be getting ready to post all of your discussion responses around this time when this is going up for our weekly discussion. And then after the spring recess in week 7, we'll have our class museum getting going thereafter. So your object paper is coming up. Be sure to be getting to work on it now. And it would be great if you could pick an object relatively soon. If you want to go ahead and check with me to see if your object is okay, go ahead and do that. And I'll probably be asking you to send me images of your object about a week before the paper is due, so that I can put together my, my lecture slides for our in-class museum. All right, so there was no reading for today, so this is a good time to go get some research done, find an object, maybe find a source to work with from it, and please let me know if you have any questions. All right, I'll see you all next week for one more lecture, and have a good one.